thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great delight being here again at the Maharajas College. I was invited first by my friend Sumijoy Olyapuram from the Malayalam department. And actually, history is not really my thing. I was pulled into it. I started with Malayalam and language and linguistics, and I just hope I managed to operate this. I take the opportunity to also dedicate this visit to our beloved teacher, Skaria Zakaria, and his other hidden teacher, Merikuti Ama, Merikuti Zakaria, who passed away recently. He passed away a few months ago, and she passed away exactly 100 days after him. And they were my first contact in Kerala, and also that's how I met Sumijoy Olyapuram, my friend. And they taught me my first Malayalam words. So, the lecture. Just to say something about Malabar, that there is no confusion here, since I'm going to talk about... No, I'm fine. I prefer actually standing. Thank you. I'm actually now going to present my work on the older period, before the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, who basically confined Malabar to a smaller area, okay? So in this lecture, Malabar is a more extended territory, including parts of Karnataka, southern Karnataka, and including the whole of the southwest coast of India, okay? So I hope that is clear. And this is one of the reasons I'm going to refer to Malabar Jews. And in a way, the concept of Malabar is like parallel to the concept of Kerala. At the same time that Malabar emerges in the Arabic, Judeo-Arabic sources, and Hebrew sources as well, and Syriac sources, at the same time, the idea of Kerala emerges. Okay, but before that, why do I call it reading source against the grain? The problem of the sources. The problem of the sources is time, place, and language. This is a problem with the sources related to the Jews of Kerala, or Malabar Jews, but I think it also is a problem with other histories of communities in Kerala. As for time, what is happening with the history is that later sources from the 17th century onwards and until the 1960s more or less are read backwards, okay? So information collected during the colonial period, and in Kerala I would say colonialism starts even before British colonialism, right, with the Portuguese records, definitely with the Dutch. They are read backwards as if the information collected and interpreted and represented by Europeans on Kerala has more validity than sources in the indigenous languages. Place. Sometimes contemporaneous Mediterranean sources, right, sources between the 1st century and the 16th century in Syriac, in Latin, in other languages, in Arabic, also in Arabic, Mediterranean sources are read about the region as eyewitness account. That cannot, we have to critically examine also Ibn Battuta, or in the case of Jews, Benjamin of Tudela. And then finally, language. So we rely too much, or historians rely too much on sources in Portuguese, Dutch, and English, and they prioritize them over sources in Malayalam, often under the pretext that there are not enough sources in Malayalam, or that the Malayalam and sometimes Sanskrit and other Indic languages are sources that are not really history, right? Okay, so that's one point. And then, it's not really only my suggestion, this is a kind of a solution I thought it's good to find, how to read the sources in a new, fresh light, especially of the periods before the Portuguese. There is, once I kind of already in an advanced stage of my study, I read a very interesting paper by Christina Mobley about methodology in African history. The same problem is there also for African history, apparently. So she suggests triangulating the sources, and it's a good term to describe what I'm trying to do in the past few years. So first of all, I insist on working with indigenous language and really consciously pushing aside the sources that are not in indigenous languages. So I work in the context of the Jewish history with Malayalam, with Hebrew, with Jewish Malayalam, Judeo-Arabic, and Arabic, which I consider in the context of 12th century plus minus to be another indigenous language to the area. Documentary sources, so I try to differentiate between sources that are documenting real events in real time, like inscriptions, business records, and legal records, okay? These are different than literary sources, different from literary sources, like poems, songs, and travel accounts, which have to be read critically, right? Or at least understand the aesthetics and the narrative devices that are used. And finally, evidential sources in which I relate to structures, objects, landscape, rituals, and ritual practices, or other practices, and linguistic archaisms. And now I'm going to show you what I am doing with this. So I hope it's going to be a bit less boring and less theoretical. So let us start with what is Jewish history in Kerala. Jewish history in Kerala is definitely a part of Indian Ocean trade history between the 9th and the 16th century. We cannot really talk about Jewish history in Kerala without properly studying that very long period. And we're talking about contacts with the Persian Gulf, when, again, I'm talking about Jews at the moment, with Aden in Yemen, and the Malabar coast, which you can see here as a larger area than British Malabar. And of course, this is probably all known to you, the column copper plates. That's the beginning. Usually when you open an article or a book or a study of Kerala Jews, it almost always starts with the idea that the origins of, right, the black Jews or the Malabari Jews are shrouded in mystery and legends, and no, they are not. We have records. We should treat them seriously. So this is one of them. So let us have a look at the column copper plates as a document that is very important for Jewish history. So the column copper plates 849, even exact date. I think there is also a day, but I can't remember precisely the decipherment of the day. Has, as you all probably know, and this is of course an image taken from Keshavan Velutat and Draga Bavaria's book of 2013. So we have the last plate, right, with Kufic Arabic engravings of names, and underneath Pahlavi, and then we have names in the Hebrew script. So we can definitely be sure that those who inscribed their names in the Hebrew script, right, probably on a piece of paper, and the local artisan, right, the metal worker, bronzesmith, was looking at something unfamiliar and completely struggling to put the Hebrew characters on the copper. It's quite obvious to anybody who knows a little bit of Hebrew that some of the letters there were missed. So let's look at the names. The first name, and of course you know about the Kufic and the Pahlavi. If you would like to discuss this as well, I'm happy to after when we have a discussion. So the first name is Hassan Ali. And also the second name is Ishaq Smi'il. Pay attention. What is Smi'il? Right? Isn't it interesting that the Jew has Ishmael for his name, Smi'il, and very Arabic also? Then we have Avraham Kouami, who is from the city of Qom in Persia. And finally, Zikri Yahya, that the way his name is written, he was probably an Arabic speaker. All the rest, all the other three, must have been Persian Jews. We know it because what is written, what is framing each name is actually the Persian language. It's not Hebrew. Hamgun man Hassan Ali Farish Guhum. I am to witness. I am Hassan Ali. Hamgun is probably related to Hamara, right? In Hindi, it's a related term. So this is Hassan Ali and Ishaq Smi'il and Abraham Kouami and Zikri Yahya. These four merchants established a trade network that surfaces later in the Cairo Geniza records between the 11th and the 13th century. Do I have to say a few words about the Cairo Geniza? Students there at the back, please don't hesitate to say yes. I don't want to bore you with details and lose you, okay? Shall I say a few words about the Cairo Geniza? So you see in Cairo, which is in Egypt, right, which is a very dry and hot place, there was a synagogue, a very special synagogue, and a very old one too, that was erected more or less around that time of the 10th, 11th centuries. What do Muslims do with Quran copies or important documents written in Arabic when they are full of holes and they are torn up? Do they throw them away? They do? They just throw them away to the waste? No, right? What do they do with these documents? Huh? You have to either store them at the top of below the roof of the mosque, right? You do something which is respectful with these records, okay, right? So Jews are similar in that sense. The written letter is very important for the Semitic religions, right? What Jews do, they have a special room in each synagogue in which they put old and torn prayer books or Bibles or important manuscripts in the Hebrew script, okay? And every once in a while, there comes the rabbi and takes them out and takes them to a special pure place where it's usually a man, I'm sorry about that, girls, I cannot just say he and she here, buries them with a special prayer, a respectful prayer, okay? Because these are holy objects. And this synagogue in Cairo is very special because they were too lazy to empty it for 1,000 years. And in the 19th century, they started finding very interesting records there, a whole bunch of records. Now, among those records were those interesting business letters exchanged between Jewish merchants, but not only, but mainly, between the 11th and the 13th century. This trade network must have ceased from operating in the 13th century because we stopped having letters from those India traders. And these records include business and personal letters of Jews traveling in the Indian Ocean trade routes. This image is taken from S.D. Goitein and Mordechai Akiva Friedman's book called The India Book, was published in 2008. They were, when we studied the fragments of letters and business records, we learned that they were Arab, Persian, and Jewish partners. And this is a very well-known image of an Indian Ocean ship. Maybe some of you already seen it. It's a very famous one from the book of travels called Maqamat al-Hariri. It's now at National Library of Paris. This is just one image. The whole book is illustrated and travels and adventures. It's a fantasy literature, kind of. But this depiction of an Indian Ocean ship is very well known for Indian Ocean scholars to imagine how this enterprise was taking place. You can see on the ship you have an Indian navigator, probably a Shaivite, okay, a Hindu Shaivite. There is a small Shiva temple on the dock. That's the kind of structure. There are South Indian seafarers managing the sails. Below the dock, there are the Persian, Arab, and the Arab traders, among them Jews. Of course, there were Muslims, there were Christians, there were Zoroastrians. And below are, according to the art historians, Africans that are managing the ship from below. And the interesting thing, if you look into the details of this illustration, you will see small lotuses carved into the side of the ship, indicating the South Indian artisans were involved in this craftsmanship. Okay, so these letters are actually not written in Hebrew. You have to to differentiate between the Hebrew script and the Hebrew language. These are two different things, right? Just like we have Sanskrit that can be written in Malayalam characters or in Tamil characters, etc. So this is actually Arabic. Arabic is a little bit like Sanskrit in this way, right? You can write Arabic in Syriac script or in Hebrew script, okay? So this is the Hebrew script, but the Arabic language. And what we see in those business records of the India traders are Malayalam words, okay, that are of interest to us. I'm not going to talk much about them. I just want to mention it because obviously at this period, the connections between the Jewish traders and the local population became strong enough that Malayalam words creep into those records, okay? So, of course, this is a system, this is an indication for a system of kinship networks, right? Because in medieval times, and actually even later on into the Dutch period, as late as the Dutch period, if you were a foreign merchant starting a business here, what you would like to have is a local wife and bilingual children. And that also, I have to mention Mahmoud Kuria's work here, right? Who is studying the matrilineal communities of the Indian Ocean. It's not special to Kerala. The thing is that Jews have a problem with that, okay? Because conversion is a big issue, especially of, well, not only, but for a woman, she has to be, it's a very complicated issue. Judaism is inherited by the children of the mother's side. So Judaism is actually funny in the sense that it has patrilineal system of inheritance, but matrilineal system of passing on the Jewish affiliation. I'm taking too much time, I'm sorry, I'll rush it a little bit. But here is a little piece of evidence from the Geniza records for such bilingual child. The name of this merchant, the partner in the network, one of the business associates of the merchant who received the letter in Malabar, is Ishaq el-Banyan, which means Isaac, the Banya merchant, right? An Indian merchant. Probably he was not a Jew because his name is pronounced as in Arabic and is not as in Hebrew. In Hebrew it would be Itzhak, and in Arabic is Ishaq, okay? And this is how they write it. Okay. So that's why we should talk about Malabar, and here I am restricting myself to Kerala, maybe a little bit of southern Karnataka is also in this map. But we can start talking from this period. There is a lot of evidence for Jewish networks, kinship networks of the Malabar coast between the column copper plates, and I'm going to speak on a very important year, 1344, that brings us directly to Kochi. But in this long period of several centuries, we have evidence for Jewish contacts in Kolam, in Madai at the north, okay, in Mangalore, of course, in Karnataka, and finally in central Kerala, in Chenamangalam and Kochi. So first is Chenamangalam. In Chenamangalam, there is a tombstone which is dedicated, a woman died there in 1269. Her name was Sarah Bat Israel. The name Bat Israel, daughter of Israel, is a typical convert name. She must have been a matrilineal landlord. Otherwise, you know, who would invest in a tombstone and a grave? You need a land. And of course, also in the Geniza records, we see evidence that at least some of those intermarriages were with Nayar landlords. I'm absolutely convinced about that. Then what happens in 1344, some 7 centuries later, is this inscription, a synagogue inscription from Kochi, that is dated 1344 according to, pay attention, Anno Mundi. The Chenamangalam tombstone is, the date is according to the era of contracts, which is the Asian Jewish system of dating inscriptions and documents at that period. But European Jews dated according to Anno Mundi. That means that European Jews, probably from the northern Mediterranean, that is either Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, were involved in this enterprise. Now, we need to fill the gaps between the documentary sources. These are the documentary sources we have: column copper plates, the Geniza records, and these inscriptions. And this is for quite a long period. What happens between? How can we fill in those gaps? So these are the important dates that we can talk about the formation of Jewish communities. The 13th century, we have 1269. Obviously, if a woman is buried, there are also relatives that can perform the burial rites, right? They know Hebrew. There's a scribe who knows Hebrew. The guy who incised the Hebrew character on the granite stone knew what he was doing. It's not like the column copper plates, okay? And 1344. So we can talk first the stage of itinerant merchants and trade networks. Secondly, a few Jewish families probably affiliated to Yemen. And then we have a Jewish congregation. No one will build a synagogue if there are no Jews to pray there. You need at least 10 men who can read Hebrew and perform the rituals, and you already need a few good decades to have Jewish kids to educate them, right? So what evidence we have for that? How does a synagogue emerge all of a sudden from that trickle, right, trickling contacts? So now I would like to talk a little bit about evidential sources like linguistic fossils. Here is an example. In Jewish Malayalam that I documented in the early 21st century, I was surprised to hear them say avanik, jivanik, mupanik, okay, and not avane as it is in normal Malayalam, right? I hear some giggles here, and some of you may identify it as the normal way in which Muslims say, right? Avanik. Sometimes they are cracking jokes about this Muslim Malayalam, right? So this is an archaic dative, okay? Sorry for the very kind of technical term, but ikke ceases to be used in Malayalam around the 13th century. Okay? But these communities retained in their dialects this usage. Okay? You can say, okay, it's like Tamil, but they were here in Kerala, right? So we can say that their dialect of Malayalam, or some scholars would say religiolect, okay? It's influenced by the contacts within the religious community, starts forming around the 13th century. In Jewish Malayalam, and I'm sure if you start looking into Mapila Malayalam, you will find similar features of archaic lexims that are retained in Jewish ritual objects. I know that historians don't like this linguistic stuff too much, so please bear with me, and I hope it's going to be worthwhile. So for example, in Jewish Malayalam, they say Shirya Divasam, for a holiday which is occurring every year in July, August. It's a day of mourning, the day of destruction of the temple. You have to fast and pray all day long. And when I first heard this term, I wondered what it was. And I'll tell you shortly. Another interesting term that is, I think, belongs to the 13th century is Ma'i Beracha. Beracha is baraka, just like Arabic, blessing, and Ma'i is a little bit mysterious. Literally, it means, what does he need for the ritual? He needs wine. You can't find wine here, right? You need raisins, and that's the wine that the Malabar Jews made was from raisins. They had dry grapes, raisins. They would make wine from it. Also, Yemeni Jews used to do that. And we have evidence in the Geniza records. There recently was published a lovely book called Abraham's Luggage by Elizabeth Lambourne. The whole book about a list of items that a Jewish merchant in medieval times asks to be sent to him and to be packed by his family and sent back to West Asia. Among those items in the letters of this trader raisins are an important item to be shipped to him for his personal use. Raisins, wheat, and paper. That's what Jews need for their prayers. So far, so good? Okay. So we have evidence for that, and I just thought to share with you how this ritual looks like, at least in Yemen. Oops, it didn't work, sorry. Let's see if I can, well, forget about the video, it's not a big issue, and also it's getting long. So maybe we can put the links there. The point is that the children see the father reciting a prayer, which can last for a few long minutes, and maybe the wife asks, what are you doing? And he says, I'm doing the bracha, right? And it happens at dusk, and then the wife starts calling it ma'i bracha, right? This is the blessings of the dusk time, just like lighting sandhya lamp, right? And then it becomes the term, okay? And what about Shirya Divasam? And here again, we have to think about the Indian Ocean trade networks. Shirya Divasam doesn't happen every week, right? The 9th of Ab. It happens once a year. But this is a very important period of the year, because if you're a Jewish merchant or any merchant coming from West Asia to the Malabar coast, you have to time your visits according to the monsoon winds patterns, right? So you come sometime between November and April, May, the cyclone starts, and then June, the monsoon starts, and then you get stuck, right? You have to stay in the region, and that's why also you need a household, right? You need to be a part of an extended family in order to survive. So they get stuck, and here comes July, and then August, and sometime between July and August every year, this holiday occurs, so you must perform it in Kerala, and you must give it a name for those who see what you are doing, right? It's a very prominent day. So you use the terminology in Old Malayalam, again, what is Shir? Okay, Shir, it again took me some time to dig into the lexicons and the dictionaries. It doesn't have much sense in Malayalam. If you can say, okay, what is Chir? Chir is to hiss, right? But in Tamil, in archaic Tamil, it means to destroy. And now in Malayalam, you would say Ari in order to say destroy. At least in Jewish Malayalam, when they talk about the destruction of the temple, they use Ariuga, not Chiruga. So again, this is a term that must have been coined in the 13th, between the 12th and 13th centuries. And what they remember now is this strange object, which is the Torah scroll covered in black for that day of mourning, which Jewish Malayalam speakers in Israel who migrated as kids remember how their parents and grandparents used to tell them, finish your food or else I will call Shirya Muta to hit you, you know? And I asked them, what is this Shirya Muta? And they said, oh, this is this thing, you know, the Torah scrolls, which looks very frightening and menacing. And then, the whole thing about Shirya Divasam as 9th of Ab came out. And it is indeed a calque translation, like a mirror translation of another Hebrew term for the day, Yom HaChurban, which is the day of destruction. So Shirya Divasam is just a literal translation of that. Okay. So I'll rush through a little bit, it's not so important. What about the Torah pointer? And this object is really interesting. So they say Tushi. This is a Torah pointer. You can see the image here. It's very stylized nowadays. Since the 19th century, it's a decorated object. Of course, it comes from Sanskrit suji, needle, right? And many Malayalam speakers still use tushi for say, suji, right? So maybe it's not an old term. So is it indeed from 13th, 14th century Malayalam? And of course, this is an important object when we talk about a synagogue and a congregation, right? We need this object in order to read from the Torah. But here is the thing, because when Jewish Malayalam speakers want to say needle, they say suji and not tushi. So they have two different meanings for these two terms. They are not used interchangeably. This is one thing. Another thing, let us think about the object itself, Okay, let us talk a little bit about the history of Torah pointers in worldwide Jewish communities. So what is this thing? The first use of this object, it was just a very humble stick that the Hebrew teacher that was teaching the children in the Otu Madam, okay? Otu Madam is just the same as Otu Pali, right? He was using this stick in order to point at the books on the Hebrew characters to instruct the children. And there's a reference to this object used for education in a book called Sefer Hasidim. Nobody knows precisely where it comes from, but they think Italy, and it is dated between the 13th and 14th centuries, precisely the period that we are interested in. And what is written there in Sefer Hasidim is also very interesting. Perhaps we shouldn't read the whole thing, so I'm not wasting too much time. But the point is that, right, somebody just made this small stick in order to teach the kids, for showing them the words and the letters, and this is the name of the object. The author says tandoor in French, which means just to indicate, to point, or in German he says it's Teithelzel, a small stick, so nobody calls it a needle, okay? That's important. And there's a whole discussion about what to do with this thing, you know, when it gets kind of, you need to smoothen it, and you shouldn't let the little bit of dust to fall on the floor because it used to point on Hebrew characters. You got the picture, right? Okay, so that's interesting. The thing is that this becomes a stylized object to be used with the Torah scrolls and not in a kind of an arbitrary manner only in the late 14th century in Germany and the late 15th century in Italy, okay? But, let us have a little detour to Afghanistan, in Ghur. They found there these interesting objects that are dated between the 12th and the 13th centuries, and what is written on them is kar. This is the kar, the needle, to be used for pointing on the Torah in reading. Here are the terms. The whole phrase is bar lab idar, the needle which is on the lips of the door. And the art historians who studied these objects were wondering, what does it mean, the lips of the door? And in order to understand what does it mean, they didn't know the terms used in Malayalam, right? Because usually Jewish historians don't study Malayalam, but they saw an image of this thing from Cochin. Okay, and then they realized that probably that's the place where this card, this needle, this tushi is placed in the Cochin practice. This is from Parur. It is put on a little loop that is closing the Torah scrolls like a casket covering it, okay? So they figure out, that's why they say in 12th or 13th century Afghanistan that this object goes on the lips of the door. And you can see the way it is shaped in Cochin is like a needle and not like a stylized hand, right? So the object itself, more than the words, is indicative of a very old formation, and that can explain, right, if this object migrated from Afghanistan to Kerala, right, or from any other place in the Persian Gulf that we know they had connections already to Kerala, also its name migrated, Tushi, right, because that's how it is called in Judeo-Persian. This is one. And the second point, we can now see how it is possible that in 1344 we had a synagogue congregation with people who can read Hebrew, children's education, etc., etc. So far, so good? Okay. So the images I got from Yehoshua Eliyahu, from his grandfather's collections of images, Pumala Elias, who had a little Jewish magazine published in Narnagulam in the first half of the 20th century. So now let's talk about landscape and Kochi port. And please bear with me, I hope within 10 minutes to finish, okay? Kochi port, as you know, did not exist before 1341, when a tsunami or earthquake or a flood hit the littoral and created what is known later as Pudo Viper, right? That is the first year of the new peace, right? The new island that was formed. And a natural island was formed, natural harbor was formed at the same time. But until then, there were only fishers on that coast, right? There was no market, right? Maybe some of you have another information I'll be happy to hear. The thing is that 1 or 2 years after this flood, we have this wonderful Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta, who gets stuck in Coricod, the ship he was supposed to travel with all his slaves and slave girls and wealth, sailed because of a terrible cyclone, and he had to travel all the way down to Kolam to find them. And he writes about his journey, very interesting journey, but then halfway through, on the 5th day of our journey, he says, we reached Kunji Kari, right? And he says in Kunji Kari there is a group of Jews, and they have an Amir, a prince. It's not really a prince, like a chieftain, like a Narduvari, okay? One of their own, a Jew, and they pay taxes, jizya, in his idea of what a tax is. It's a jizya, right? To the king sultan of Kolam. And a little bit later, we find Kadavum synagogue built there. So, how do we know that Kunjikari is where Kadavum synagogue is? Because if we start tracing the phonemes, Kunjikari is probably a Tamil pronunciation in 14th century of Konje, right? Koche, little, and Angadi, Arabicized in his ears. Kunjingadi, we can imagine something like that, right? And of course, later on in Malayalam, it is called Kochangadi. And this is precisely the way, if you take a rickshaw driver to Kadavum synagogue in Cochin, this is precisely what they tell you. This is Kochangadi area, right? This is the neighborhood, this is the street. So this is Kochangadi synagogue, okay? And you can see from an aerial image that this synagogue was built in a way that the front was facing the Kadavu, right? The wharf. Where is this inscription now? This inscription now is in the Pardeshi synagogue. Okay? After the Jews migrated to Israel, this synagogue had actually 3 inscriptions. 2 of them are now in the wall of the Pardeshi synagogue. So, this is an inscription from 1550. It was donated to that same synagogue that already was there for few good centuries by one Jacob Castile and another Baruch Levi, okay? 1550, by the way, according to the era of contracts. That means that these two, one is a Castilian merchant and another is a German merchant, actually reached Kochi via Yemen, and their affiliation was to Yemeni Jewry and not to European Jewry. Now it is known as the Black Jewish Synagogue, right? But actually this synagogue belonged to the founders of the port town in Kochi. It's only 1 or 2 years after Ibn Battuta passes by. He doesn't see Muslims there, he doesn't see Hindus there, he sees Jews there, okay? This is where this inscription was, in the entrance to Kadavum before it was demolished in the 1970s. And the other old inscription was found at the attic of Kadavum synagogue, that is now collapsed. It is reported by David Sassoon, a cataloger of Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions of India in 1932, where he writes, okay, he doesn't say where he knows that from, but he writes that the inscription was taken to Kadavumbagam after Tipu Sultan burned the Kochangadi synagogue. Now you tell me, was Tipu Sultan in Cochin? Did he reach Cochin? Did he burn anything in Cochin? Why does David Sassoon write like that? And what does this inscription do in the Bangladeshi synagogue? Why do they attribute it to any other synagogue rather than Kadavumbagam? Okay, so I have to wrap up. I don't want to take too much time. Another synagogue was built in Kochi a little bit later. This is, of course, the map of Kochi, right? We have the palace, Matancheri Palace, built in 1555, if the information is correct, I'm not sure. Then you have below that the white Jewish synagogue in a piece of a plot taken from the Maharaja gave them that piece of plot. That means that there was no room in the neighborhood and in Jewtown for one more synagogue, right? Because actually there was another synagogue that is no more, which is Tekumbagam Synagogue. This is Tekumbagam synagogue site. Now there's a private home there. I think now this is an old photo, it's renovated. It was completely demolished in 1957, not very clear by whom, perhaps by community member, not very clear why. And it too had an inscription dated from 1489, again donated by a Castilian Jew, Jacob Castiel, according to the era of contracts, to the Yemeni system at the time. And in all studies of this community, they ignore this inscription. Okay? Why? Because this synagogue belonged to black Jews, so whatever inscription it had doesn't matter. This image was given to us by Taufik Zakaria in 2019. It was found in 2017. And another important image is of this tombstone. Again, the image, I think Taha, you took those images, right? He's sitting here. Taufik just told me about it yesterday. I didn't know. So Taha also deserves credit here. He took the image of this tombstone of Isaac Sulam, found at the site where the Tekumbagam synagogue used to be. Okay. And the importance of this tombstone, again, is that it belonged to an Italian Jew by the name Isaac Sulam, who died in 1618. So we have communities of black Jews, right, labeled as black Jews, and perhaps instead of me continuing to talk about it, you can think about what does it mean that I have to come all the way from Glasgow to tell you that Kochangadi Synagogue, that is Kadavumbagam Synagogue, that collapsed, is 600 years old, okay? That the community of this synagogue actually established the small market, the market town of Kochi in 1344, okay? It's not because I am a Jew I want to tell you Jews established it. That's not the point here. The point here is that we all forgot about it because for many years they were labeled as black, right? That's why I and many others prefer talking about Malabar Jews, okay? So, and of course, what does it mean that the whole synagogue disappears, the inscription disappears, nobody takes seriously what we do have in the records, and nobody takes it seriously that there were, by the 16th century, there were already 2 synagogues in Cochin, and both of them were the joint creation of European and Asian Jews. Nobody needed here the Portuguese to connect the local Jews with Europe. That's the point. Okay, I'll stop here because this is really the bottom line, and thank you very much for listening. And if you'd like to ask something, I'm here at your service.